with the church, especially as you gathered around the altar, around the body and blood of Christ. This idea that it's me and God doing it on my own, and I can just split around the churches, whatever kind of pleases me on a given Sunday, or maybe I'll just turn on TV or the radio and listen to a good sermon, and that's sufficient. The early Christians would have scratched their head and said, what are you thinking? How can you be a Christian like that? If we put that in the context of a family, families like to gather together, don't they? It's a dysfunctional family, a dysfunctional human being, a dysfunctional child who does not want to go home, who does not want to come home for supper, who runs away from his family. That is dysfunctional. And I hope I'm not over-exaggerating this, but I would say we could make the same claim for Christians. Those Christians who run from the family, that's a bit dysfunctional. We find our identity with the church. Back to the text. I want to go down to verse 12. Joseph removed his children from his knees. He bows himself with his face to the earth. And then he says this great little speech. Joseph took Ephraim in his right hand towards his left hand, and Manasseh in his left hand. Let's see, did I want to make a comment on the word redeemed? Where did that verse occur? Is that up in verse 4 somewhere? Or is that later on? I guess it's coming up a little. I want to comment on the word redeemed. It's probably in Joseph's comments here later on. Joseph takes his sons and he puts them in front of his father to bless them. And now Jacob is going to do a strange thing. What does he do with these two sons as he prepares to bless them? He takes his hands and he crosses them, and he blesses the younger one instead of the elder one. And Joseph gets very upset about that because the older one should get the blessing. There may be something going on here a little bit with Joseph because he was the oldest son of the favorite wife. And maybe he expected that this blessing should flow out to his oldest son as it was to him also, you see, as he has expected it would. But here the blessing is reversed. What does that teach us about God? We see this throughout the Bible, don't we? God tends to choose the most unlikely, the youngest, to give his blessings to. It's an amazing thing. We can tell story after story after story. Great King David, the oldest. I think he have, was it 7 brothers? I forget the details. 6 or 7 brothers. They all come before. One, boom, 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 boom. David is out tending the sheep. Samuel says, don't you have any more children? One of these is supposed to be the king. Well, I got the little boy. He's out there taking care of the flock, you see. Well, get him in here. David comes in. That's the one. That's one story among many. That God choosing usually the most unlikely. If we get to the Christian church, you get centuries later, Paul picks up on this in the Corinthian congregation. How does he describe those members in Corinth? You remember? Not many of you are the wealthiest. Not many of you are the most powerful. Not many of you are elegant. But God has chosen the, put it in own words, the weak and insignificant things. Why? Why does God work this way? So that if there's any glory going to be given for what's accomplished in the church, the glory will go to, there you go, God, not us. And so if you look at the Christian church throughout history and you compare it with, well, I shouldn't mention General Motors, they about went belly up, didn't they? I was going to say, some of these corporations, you know, they have these high-powered executives and so, well, maybe they have learned something, okay? Maybe they're not so great after all, I don't know. But you look at the church, how it's bumbled through the centuries in a certain sense. You look at the pastors and bishops that have served the church, they often haven't been the most pious people, and yet the church has survived. It's an amazing thing. And Paul's words, I think, reflect what's going on here. This is just one example among many. The older shall serve the younger. It always seems to go backwards. How many of you are the oldest? Too bad. Okay. I want to look at verse 15. And he blessed Joseph and said, the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked. Notice that Jacob here identifies himself with what has gone on before. He is not interested in starting some kind of new cult around himself. That is not an unimportant point. And if I may go back to the Lutheran Reformation and make an application here, you've heard his story a dozen times. It was never Martin Luther's intention to build a cult around himself. It was to take the Roman Church and reform it and continue the church. And that's why we Lutherans properly understand ourselves as good Catholic Christians in the right understanding of the word. And we kept many of the customs and traditions of the Catholic Church. If the Pope doesn't like it, that's too bad. In fact, the argument would be that it's the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, who has actually drifted off from the Catholic Church, not us. That's a fact. By the way, I have been reading, if I just go off the subject a little bit, reading about the Eastern Orthodox Church a lot the last couple of weeks. I got kind of interested in that. Did I mention this last week? How the Lutherans, after Luther's death, some Lutherans from Tübingen, Germany, took the Augsburg Confession and translated it into Greek and sent it to the Patriarch of Constantinople, which is today Istanbul. And there was a dialogue, written dialogue, that went back and forth between the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Lutherans in Tübingen, trying to establish some church fellowship there. They were very hospitable towards each other. They respected each other. The Tübingen theologians called the Bishop of Constantinople, the Patriarch, called him your Holy Reverence, Holy Father. They spoke very reverentially to him. Unfortunately, that ended with the Greek Orthodox Patriarch writing back and saying, if you're serious about this, come back to the church. Because the Eastern Orthodox Church, like Rome, has always understood themselves to be the church. And that the Lutherans were interested in not being a cult or a sect, they should come back to the Greek Orthodox Church. That was how it finally ended. I don't think, as I read that, though, that the Lutherans ever went after the Greek Orthodox for that. I think they were just disappointed, very disappointed. Nothing happened there. If you study the Greek Orthodox, they're much closer to us Lutherans than the Church of Rome, that's for sure. They do not officially accept purgatory. Some of their patriarchs years ago kind of said, well, we'll put up with it when they were friendly towards Rome, but never really made it a dogma. A lot of the doctrines in the Eastern Orthodox are quite close to the Lutherans. Interesting thing. That dialogue probably is still going on. I don't think it'll ever come anywhere. But back to the text here. Joseph takes his sons. I want to go to verse 15. The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life long to this day. Who's speaking these words? Israel or Jacob. We might look back at Jacob's life and say this is a real faith statement. Think of, I'm going to quote Pastor Johnson today, the manure that God spread all over his life until he got to this point. I mean, think of this. His favorite, first of all, he gets ripped off by his Uncle Laban, so he has to put up with the weak-eyed wife for a while until he gets the good one. Then he's got these two concubines or slave girls, he got to move, and these wives of his constantly fight over him. You know that story? Yeah, we won't go there. You can read that on your own. It's colorful stories in the Old Testament. And then, of course, as you know this, I don't rehearse everything, but his favorite son, Joseph, is, of course, sold into slavery. He has to live how many years? 17, 20 years, assuming his favorite son is dead. His wife dies, Rachel, giving birth to Benjamin. And then they say, well, the story goes on. And here Jacob is able to look back on his life, and what does he say? What does he say? He has been my shepherd all my life to this day. Now there is a faith statement. In the Lord's Prayer we say, thy will be done. What does this mean? Who knows how it starts out? This is a faith statement. The good and gracious will of God is always done indeed without our prayer. Therefore we pray that it may be done among us also. And that is a fact. God's good and gracious will is always done, even when he's spreading manure all over our lives, to quote Pastor Johnson again. And there is a matter of faith. It's easy to think God's good and gracious will is being done when everything's going well in your life and you're enjoying prosperity. However, let a little manure be spread on your life, and then what are you going to say? Can you still say God's good and gracious will is being done? And that's why Luther says, may we recognize his good and gracious will. Yeah, David.